Dr.
Hello,
Callen,
Mike.
great to see you.
Nice to see you. You're up in the mountains again?
Yeah, I've got a different lake back behind me. This is Monarch Lake up in
Okay.
same range, but a different section called Mineral King.
Hmm. Do you do some hiking?
I do. I haven't done a whole bunch, but I'm getting ready to do a whole bunch. I'm getting ready to take my daughters hiking, and so looking forward to getting out and exploring.
Oh, that'll be fun. You've got some great country there.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What about you? Have you done any
Where-
hiking?
where- excuse me?
Have you done any hiking yourself?
Not really. We have a we have a state park here in town,
Yeah.
right on the edge of town, and I wander through the woods there. But I wouldn't call that hiking. That's just taking a walk from the car and coming back. So I don't think that counts.
Yeah, as I said,
So not really.
there's not too much elevation gain in the Anderson area, if I remember correctly.
There's not, although this little park out there has some real gullies and some real interest. Not mountainous,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of interest. It isn't flat in there, but but the middle part of the state here is mildly rolling.
Yeah.
It's flatter as you go north, and then you get some nice hill country as you get down south. You go down toward the Ohio River,
Okay.
and you do get a lot more of a hill. So Brown County State Park is toward the south in Indiana,
Yeah.
very popular tourist location. Um, Little town of Nashville
Okay.
is just full of all kinds of artists, and um, that would be Nashville, Indiana. There's a bigger one on down in Tennessee,
Yeah.
uh, but it's a delight. Nashville's a delightful place to visit.
That's great.
People wander around. There's a little community theater that does evening shows and
Yeah.
uh, a reptile museum, which
Wow.
my wife refuses to go into. She thinks there may be snakes in there, which is the point.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are.
When we took a cross country trip a couple of years ago and traveled into Anderson, and then from Anderson, I think we went down, all the way down into Kentucky. We went to see the Ark Museum. And so we took a little bit of a longer route to be able to get there, but went through some of the Amish country in Ohio and stuff. And so it was quite beautiful.
A lot of Amish country in northern Indiana also.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, yeah, there's a lot of Amish in this part of the country.
Yeah. We came
And
into
some of them now,
Anderson. We came into Anderson from Michigan. So yeah, we passed through some of
oh
it.
yeah, you went down through, yeah, okay. You can go through Amish country. A lot of Mennonites. Well, actually, one of the very first things that started the Church of God movement in the northern Indiana part did involve Mennonites.
Oh, really?
Uh, yeah. Um, the first book that was published, Daniel Warner's big Second Work of Grace volume, was published in Goshen, Indiana by the Mennonite Publishing House.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, the folks who flooded into the movement in the early two or three generations were predominantly Methodists and Mennonites.
Okay.
And that's partly why we're quite the mixture of um, Wesleyan holiness and Anabaptist.
Yeah. That's where the Anabaptist
Unusual
comes from.
combination, but that's a big Mennonite infusion early
Yeah. Wow.
among us, and brethren. There are quite a few brethren also.
Okay. I just finished reading Saints in Exile by Cheryl. Oh my goodness, I can't pull her last name. Uh,
Sanders,
yeah, Dr. Sanders, and it was a
right?
great read. I felt like that book, maybe more than some of the others that I've been reading, really brought to light some of the things. Even I know she wasn't fully focused on Church of God history, but she did weave quite a bit of it in, and
Mhm.
really helped me understand what happened, especially as Azusa Street revival had happened, because I understood that William Seymour, had been greatly influenced by D.S. Warner, and so I was intrigued, like what happened here, and how did we started as Holy Spirit people, and it seemed like then we maybe got a little bit afraid. So
No, Seymour came up from the south, I forget now, Arkansas or whatever,
yeah,
and he met the evening lights, the evening saints in
yeah,
Cincinnati, Ohio, and that's where he was ordained
yeah,
in the Church of God early. Um, but yeah, he went out west, became very involved with the Pentecostal movement,
yeah,
and our historians earlier just sort of shunned him as
yeah,
having slipped off the edge.
yeah,
I've told his story in two or three of my books recently to reintroduce him
yeah,
uh, to us, because after all, right now, I'm the editor of Aldersgate Press of the Wesleyan Holiness Connection,
yeah.
and the publisher is David Hahn, who is the dean of faculty of the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee,
Okay,
Pentecostal Seminary.
yeah.
So right now, Aldersgate is headed by two Church of God people,
Oh,
one
that's
Pentecostal, one non-Pentecostal.
yeah.
And as a matter of fact, he's a Korean.
Okay,
Um, so he maintains a lot of contacts with the church in Korea and in Latin America.
wow.
Valuable guy, David Hahn,
That's
good friend.
oh, hey Randy, hey Steve, good to see you guys.
Hello.
Steve, I'm not able to see your video yet, but I understand you may be even at work too, so I understand if that happens. But if you're able to jump on and say a hello to us, we'll wait, guys, we got about 3 more minutes at least by my clock. We'll greet people, and then we'll jump in and let those who might arrive late go ahead and join us while we're heading on out. So, hey, while we're waiting, jump in. Randy, what's something you're celebrating in the last couple of weeks time frame?
Well, of course, celebrating Easter and
Yeah,
the good gathering we had on Sunday. That was good. We had a couple of baptisms, and
great.
so that was exciting. So yeah, but just enjoying that, and then just our family, my wife's daughter and grandchildren. And son-in-law, they've moved to Florida, and they're purchasing a house down there and
Yeah.
moving to North Carolina. They got a business that's going well, so we're celebrating that with them because they've had a long struggle. So
Great. That's great. And were you able to get a hold of Gilbert? Was he able to help out at all?
I've touched base with him. He's looking for someone. And my dad's still lingering, so we're just
Yeah.
kind of holding on.
Okay, great. Well, we something we're celebrating in our household is just a little bit more than a week ago. We have a new licensed driver in the home. So Emily, my daughter, took her driver's license test and passed, and so she is wanting to find out all the ways that she can help to be able to run errands and go to the grocery store. So she's definitely burning up fuel quite a bit, but she's doing a great job.
On Friday, we had in our household a great grandson
Yes.
born, and tomorrow there's going to be an inducing,
Uh-huh.
and we're going to have another grandson,
Oh my goodness.
number 5
Yeah.
boys in that family,
Wow.
one daughter. We've offered them money to buy books to explain how this is happening so they can get it stopped. They claim they know, but don't act like it.
Oh, that's great. Dr. Callen, how
Well,
much longer after our phone call did the baby come?
Probably 5 or 6 hours.
Okay. I was going to say, it seemed like you had gotten a call right at the end when we were still talking. I
Right.
didn't know if that was the final word or not.
Not quite. It dragged out a little longer than that.
Yeah.
In fact, at the last minute, they decided to switch to cesarean.
Okay.
They were afraid it was too big, and but everything went fine.
Oh, that's great.
So
Ron,
my wife.
go ahead.
Sorry.
Jump in.
My wife had one daughter, which is what she wanted, and then but I have 5 kids, and then her daughter, their family, they have 7. So she no longer has a small family.
wow.
It grew and multiplied. That's great. Well, hey, Ron, great to have you on the call. I can see your screen there, but we can't see your image. If you're able to do that, go for it and jump on. We'd love to have you viewable if possible. Well, hey guys, let's get started. Let me do an introduction for Dr. Callen, and then I'm going to hand it over to him. I got the chance a couple of days ago to be able to have a lengthy conversation with Dr. Callen about today's topic, just so that I could kind of arrive as an informed host for you guys today. But I know many of you guys know Dr. Callen. He is a very amazing author and historian in Church of God. There are numerous books that he has written that are just really helpful to be able to understand, a lot of times the history of the church, but also what brings us to the points and maybe even some of the frustrations that we currently face. And in some ways, that's going to be a little bit of what he's going to talk about today, some troubling tensions that our movement oftentimes finds itself captivated in. I got to personally meet Dr. Callen when I was a part of Project Imagine Roundtable, and it was such a pleasure. He came in to be able to be the secretary for the final report that was going to be produced for Project Imagine. And so I got I still remember the lunchtime where I got to sit with Dr. Callen. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the Dr. Callen right here across the table from me.
Ooh, I'm going to have indigestion. Oh no.
And there's Marty Grubbs and there's David Wynn. David Wynn was still relatively new to me at that time, but I felt like I was around so many famous Church of God folks all at one time. And I was just not only eating up the food, but eating up the great conversation. So it's been a pleasure to get to know Dr. Callen better. And I really appreciate his ministry. I appreciate his sense of humor often. You can hear it even in the way he was talking about his great grandkids and his grandkids as well. And so with that said, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Callen, and I'm looking forward to where you take us and where the conversation goes.
Well, thank you, Michael. I just saw another face, I think, pop in.
Yeah, that's Ron.
Okay. We have a little less than an hour, and having been a seminary prof forever, it seems, I am very comfortable with give and take questions. So even though I guess my assignment is to talk for much of the time, I don't want to spend the entire time talking, because I'd like to know what's on your mind and try to respond if I can. I was going to say right initially, this book, Forward Ever Forward, I don't know if you are acquainted with it, came out just a few months ago. It's subtitled The Church of God Movement, Yesterday and Tomorrow. This is probably the frankest book I've ever written about the Church of God, because fortunately, I'm far enough along in life now that nobody can fire me from anything that I wouldn't thank them for. So I'm not worried about that kind of thing. It's time to just say it as I see it. And so let me just say initially that by titling it Forward Ever Forward, obviously I am seeing forward progress, future reaching, and trying to celebrate in a book like this that there is a lot of real good in this tradition, and not only historically good, but very relevant to the current times, and that I think we are trying, and I love to encourage us to move aggressively forward from our yesterdays, good as they may have been, to our tomorrows, because that's where it's now important. Having said that, I guess I would also like to say that we don't have everything positive going for us. And one thing I'd like to focus on some today is one serious issue, broad issue, and that is that we began in a very excited way as a movement back in the late 19th century. And one of the reasons it was exciting was we were sure we knew who we were. And we knew we were in God's hands on the forefront of something amazing. And one of my books where I try to describe the teachings of the Church of God movement is titled Contours of a Cause. And even though a lot of things in this movement are hard to tie down, because we don't believe in tying things down, creeds, organizations, anything else, there are some very distinctive contours and shapes that actually form our identity. The big problem is that today, this many century and a half almost later, we don't anymore have a clear understanding of who we are. The excitement is hardly there as it once was, and we're needing to reinvent ourselves, and this is troubling. And Michael, just as a quick introduction, um, positive and negative, and I think we'll move today, and maybe would you like me to just start with the beginnings a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. I remember when we were talking, you mentioned that because of that historical and like really radical and inspiring, start, that it created really a vacuum that we tend to operate in now because of that big boost. So yeah, feel free, please jump in and help us understand that.
Um, all right. Since I don't think any of you are brand new in the movement, you would automatically recognize if I started to almost sing something like the days of sects and creeds for us forevermore is past. We sung those kinds of things. Some people call them Church of God marching songs. We have several of them. One of the things that was so dramatically real in the latter quarter of the 19th century was the American holiness movement. And the recognition there was that most of the holiness denominations had settled into a comfort zone and were beginning to compromise with the expanding, industrializing culture, and that somehow renewal needed to come. The idea was that it would come by a renewal of holiness among the members of the holiness denominations. If you could reinvigorate individuals, they would reinvigorate their denominations. When the Church of God arose, and it did in the midst of this revival, Daniel Warner, a primary pioneer of the Church of God movement, took a little different twist on that. He said, oh, these denominations have compromised. In fact, they're basically defunct, and they are now a drain on the true church, and they cannot be renewed well just by focusing on the renewal of their individual members. Holiness must reach to the church itself. The church must be holy. We need to think about the church as a whole. And a fundamental problem is that the church is divided up into all these denominations, and that rupturing, that fragmentation is a part of the problem. And therefore, we're not only going to try to get individuals back into serious holiness, we're going to try to totally renovate the denominational world so that the church itself can be holy again and undivided. So that made us quite distinctive. It had also put us on the margin of the holiness movement because we stood pretty much alone in that, because the others were not interested in dismembering their denominations. They just wanted to re-enliven them from within. That wasn't acceptable to Warner. And so we really took our beginnings on the outer edge of the holiness movement, almost being a major critic of the movement, even while we were in the main supportive of everything it was all about. We were trying to purify and felt that we were called to purify the bride of Christ, the church, just before the final return of Christ to claim his bride. And so you talk about excitement. We were the people who had been called by God at the end of human history to suddenly launch a massive renewal and unification of the whole bride of Christ, preparing her to be ready for his soon return. Well, I mean, that's exciting. That's what brought us together from many denominations. Unfortunately, a lot of people who came to us from those denominations were not welcome where they were. They already were somehow disenfranchised at home. So we had a lot of characters that came together to form us. Then what happened that was very significant for the vacuum to follow was that certain of our leaders began to write about how our movement really is shown in the Bible to come. Took the book of Revelation, explained that the book of Revelation, through all of its stages and the beasts and the dragons and all, is a walk through all of compromised Christian church history, showing how it was going to be resurrected into newness, one step at a time. For instance, through Luther, bringing back justification by faith, Charles and John Wesley, bringing back sanctification, the Church of God movement following that as the final Reformation, to put all of that together and to cap it with the new, united, purified church itself, ready for the bride to come. Michael, in my book, Forward Ever Forward, I thought I might read one paragraph. I tried to summarize the excitement of our early movement, because it was a powerful vision, obviously, that brought us together. I write here, the pioneers of this movement were filled with spiritual excitement and a sense of liberation from centuries of human failure. They were pilgrims setting out on a holy journey, waiting for the Lord. They had been freed by a vision of the dawning of God's new day for the true holiness formed and finally united church. This pioneer vision was that all of the human, the partial, and the non-biblical be shed from the church's life. Believers are to stand together, unified, purified, empowered, gifted, governed, and sent by God as they waited on the return of the Lord. I mean, there is power and excitement in that. So that helps to explain, and many people in the Church of God movement now don't know anything about that, because that isn't our self-understanding much anymore. And so many in our own constituents just aren't in touch with all of that. And so I think it's important that we remember there was a powerful something, and it started with holiness focused on individuals, and then on the purification of the whole church. And then wrapped all around that came this context of interpreting the book of Revelation as having our movement predicted throughout all of church history to cap off everything at the end. Wow. Well, anyone want to comment or ask a quick question? You probably recognize all of that, although a lot of folks wouldn't in the Church of God. Okay, or I'll just keep moving on unless you want to talk about something.
I was just going to have a brief comment in here. Maybe it'll even spur a little bit more on. I think I understood the holiness impetus. I knew that we were calling people out of the sect Babylon. And so I think you helped to shade that even a little bit more. I don't know, other than from our previous conversation and today, that I understood how much it was wrapped up in that interpretation of Revelation. I knew that we considered ourselves, the evening light, but I didn't quite understand how much it was tied to that kind of prophetic fulfillment of Revelation.
And I want to be fair to say, if you look at it historically, the book of Revelation interpretation isn't what came first. What came first was the holiness movement, and the extending of holiness into the being of the church itself. It was only about 10 to 12 years into the movement that two of our writers began to introduce the Revelation thing, which gave it this powerful biblical support. Well, of course, it also set up part of the vacuum about to come, because as exciting as that was, it didn't last forever. As a matter of fact, if you had been in a typical Church of God home in North America in the 19 teens, 20s, or 30s, if there were 3 books in that Church of God home, you would know for sure what they were. One was the Bible, one was F.G. Smith's book, What the Bible Teaches, and the third was interpreting the book of Revelation, Revelation Explained. Those 3 things were kind of the triple Bible of Church of God people. It identified the teachings, identified the vision, and it made very clear who we were in the whole scheme of church history. Part of the problem, of course, let me talk about the vacuum. You get the excitement and the power. What happened? Well, I put here in some notes for today, the early unraveling. Number one, Jesus, if you will, failed us. he did not return in the movement's first generation. Well, one of the things that we were counting on was that the church was so burdened with all this human machinery and organization, we sure didn't need any of it. All we need to do is criticize it. We're not going to be around long. We're just going to do the power of the excitement. But if he didn't return, we were stuck with trying to find out how to explain ourselves, sustain ourselves, perpetuate ourselves. And of all things, we were going to have to start talking about some church machinery, which we never anticipated, and whatever. Jesus did not return. Of all things, what we expected was we thought all Christians, real Christians, were going to flow out of their denominations and just enlarge our movement wonderfully as we reformed the pure church waiting on the Lord. People did come, but they didn't come in masses. And by far, most Christians stayed in their denominations. Even the holiness ones stayed there. And therefore, what happened isn't what we expected to happen. And then, again, we didn't want to do any organizing. So one of the first breakovers in organization in the Church of God was that a couple of congregations in Indiana wanted to buy a piece of property so they could regularly hold church together. And they found out that they couldn't do that unless they had a board of trustees. Well, we don't want that because the Methodists have those, so it's got to be wrong. But we broke over and we named a board of trustees so that we could incorporate a group and buy property. That was a big deal for us, a big deal indeed. As a matter of fact, what kept happening was that we were idealists. I pictured us before as a youth movement. We were a bunch of idealists. It can be done. It should be done. Don't listen to people who don't think that the perfect can't happen. The Lord is doing the perfect, and we're going to be that. But then in a generation or two, we were having to do some things that we had been severely criticizing others for doing. That creates chaos. It creates a confusion of identity. We were idealists who were having to become realists, and we weren't comfortable with that at all. As a matter of fact, that's true today. That hasn't changed much. That is deep in our DNA. Just go to a General Assembly meeting someplace and you'll find that out. But one of the big things that happened, in addition, was that some of our young people, maybe some of you, older folks, started going to school and even started doing doctoral dissertations in seminaries or universities not associated with the Church of God. And you started doing work studying from an objective point of view from the outside, the movement, looking at it organizationally, looking at it sociologically, looking at it in terms of church history that didn't look anything like what we'd been painting church history to look like. And so all of a sudden, you began to have, and it would be the case today, certainly it has been for many years now, that no Bible professor in any of our schools would teach the book of Revelation the way we were championing it in the early generations. Well, if you pull that prop out from under us because we had leaned on it for self-identity so hard, that brings a vacuum. It brings pain. It brings confusion. But that's exactly what happened. Another thing then that happened when all this vacuum things, for instance, 1917 is a pivotal year because the Anderson Bible Training School was formed. Well, now wait a minute. The second action of the General Assembly ever, and by the way, it was only formed in 1917, was we will allow this little school to exist as long as it never gives any kind of certificates or degrees to any of its students, because we cannot tolerate in the church human papers taking precedence over the gifting of the Spirit for ministry. You can't have hotshot kids out of school taking over from somebody who never went to school but is genuinely filled with the Spirit and gifting of the Spirit. And then across the 1920s, we just started doing it. We suddenly formed a board of Christian education and a board of church extension and home missions. We just started creating organizations. We were doing it with our fingers crossed behind our backs. We were doing it with some bad conscience, but we were doing it out of a sense of necessity to, number one, sustain ourselves, and number two, have some kind of a meaningful ministry that was coordinated and would work. I wanted to read for you, if I could, a paragraph, 1929. Let me see if I can, where am I going to find this? Here we go. This, you would know the name probably of Robert Reardon, longtime president of Anderson University. This is his father, E.A., who was chair of the General Assembly and a deeply loved pastor. By 1929, there were things happening in this movement where the vacuum was developing that weren't pretty, in his view. And that was that we had a lot of people who were bad-mouthing other Christians for not seeing the light the way we had seen it. And we were tightening our skirts to try to say, I don't care what's happening, we are still true, our pioneers were right, and the rest of you are wrong. And so this is a pivotal time in the movement. 1929, E.A. Reardon stands in front of the assembly, deeply loved man. And by the way, he held 3 offices in the General Assembly. And after this presentation, he was voted out of all 3 of them. E.A. says, as I look out upon the horizon of this movement, 1929, it seems to me that I can see a tendency to sectarianize it. If this tendency is allowed to go to seed, it won't be long until we shall be numbered among the dead. I believe in a clean, separate, and distinct work of God, but I also believe that we should keep the sectarian stink out of our distinction. There is such a thing as stressing the Reformation to such an extent that we cause our people to be Reformation-centered, Reformation sectarians. Well, you had a vacuum, you had frustration, you had people who were hardening their positions and being defensive out of all this confusion. And he is saying, we are slowly going to become as bad as the people we badmouthed come into being if we don't stop this. A very frightening kind of time. And by the way, it was only 1 year after that there came along what is known in our history as the Ohio Uprising. And that is that we had this little Anderson Bible Training School that had already become a liberal arts college. Can you imagine the word liberal associated with one of our schools? And John Morrison, the president, was being up for re-election as a new term for the school president. And a group of ministers in Ohio revolted and said, we'll do anything to get him out and keep him out. He's taking us down the wrong path. We should go back to being a little Bible training school. We have no business training lawyers and doctors and nurses and all the rest of that. The universities can do that. We are here to train the servants of God only. And well, unfortunately, so many things come in my head. Let me tell you one quick illustration. The president, the dean, Dean Olt at Anderson College at the time, was a professor of psychology. And he worked a little in hypnotism. And the president's secretary could not take any kind of shots to numb her mouth, and she desperately needed oral surgery. And the dean said, if you want to, I know Raleigh, dentist downtown, he would let me do this. Let's go down together. I will hypnotize you. He can take care of what needs to be done. You won't feel a thing. We went downtown, hypnotized her, went beautifully. The terrible thing is that they went back out on the street afterwards, and a reporter friend of the deans of Anderson College came by, and he reported what had happened. That story hit the wire nationally, and suddenly we had Church of God ministers in Ohio saying that the devil has entered into Anderson College and they're doing witchcraft and on. Oh my, it was unbelievable what all had happened. That was part of the Ohio uprising. And by the way, when the final vote came on Morrison in the General Assembly, he sustained his new term by 4 votes. If the 4 votes had gone the other way, there would have been a major turning in the future of our movement. Well, okay.
Dr. Callen, I got a question for you. So I think I understand, this like desire not to have infrastructure and organization that other denominations had, or that those denominations had, but then we kept compromising in there. What about like our just local level ecclesiology? What was the early ecclesiology? Because what I understand now is that somewhere in the 40s, there was something written that began to give guidance for internal infrastructure. Everybody began to be incorporated. What about before that time frame? What was that general ecclesiology that we organized ourselves in?
My understanding, I'm trying to remember, some years ago, I wrote the history of Park Place Church in Anderson. And there were 5 Church of God congregations in the city of Anderson around 1930 to 35. Only Park Place was an incorporated body. The other 4 were not incorporated. They did the best they could, staying away from the law and legal matters and whatever. It was a great, as I said, it was a great struggle for us to even elect trustees to buy property because we didn't like doing that. As a matter of fact, our earliest congregations, when they would take up an offering on Sunday, they had a box like we're doing for COVID now, tacked out in the foyer somewhere. They would not pass offering plates because that's what the Methodists did. And therefore, it has to be wrong mechanically. You had that kind of thing going on at the local level. So the ecclesiology was very congregational. One of the problems, we had one of our writers in the 1920s who said, I have to judge our pioneers to have made a very serious error in this organizational thing, because it would appear that the dozens and dozens and dozens of congregations that were established by Warner and several of his associates and his flying ministry, by 1920, only 2 of them existed, because you started a congregation with an exciting revival, but you left no structure behind, no established leadership, and most of the time they just fizzled away. That's part of our problem now, of course, is that we are fiercely independent yet at the local congregational level, but we desperately know that we're better off, and we can only be sustained if we are serious about coordinating our efforts and being accountable to each other. And there has to be some kind of a plan of accountability. And it's not in our DNA to accept plans of accountability at any level. It's just not in our DNA. That is one of our glories, and it's one of our great agonies. It just is. And Michael, you said to the Project Imagine, and you heard some of that in the conversation. It's just there. If someone says, could we set up this in the country and try to do this together? Well, but doesn't that inflect, what about my freedom? What about my well, whatever. So we had a glorious beginning. We had a variety of things happen, which created quite a vacuum in who we are. We tightened up and almost became sectarian ourselves. Some people would say we still are. We are what is it? We called the Free Methodist Church some nasty things. We called a lot of our holiness brothers and sisters some nasty things. And they called us, I did a master's thesis on this once, in all the Free Methodist literature, from 1890 to 1900, when they referred to the Church of God movement, a partner holiness movement, they referred to us in all capital letters as the No Sect sect. That's our name, the No Sect sect. And that wasn't meant to be a pleasant thing. Well, what I thought I would do, more time just flies like crazy. I'm going to indicate here that I've written down on my sheet here, 6 quick reasons why I would say that a struggle we've had in the movement over all these generations since has been fear. We have been a very afraid people. Can you imagine how confident we were? We were the chosen of God to bring in the end times and all of that. And now the fear, let me just quickly indicate what they are as I would see them. Number one, we are afraid of violating our own reform heritage by being involved with cooperative ministry efforts that may be less than ideal. To do it right, have to we do it ourselves? Back in the 1980s, the General Assembly voted a resolution that none of our national agencies dare have any working relationships with any element of the National Council of Churches, Christian education, anything. Well, a lot of them were deeply involved in whatever, and they were shocked that this would be the case. We were afraid that if you involve yourself with Christians who don't see the light, we will be compromised in the process. Well, let's see. Can we tolerate a compromised witness that comes from questionable associations with denominational and ecumenical brothers and sisters? We were afraid of we say all the time, we reach our hands in fellowship to every blood-washed one. As long as we don't have to touch them, that's kind of COVID, or in any way risk being changed by them when we're trying to change them. We've had this great fear. One of the things, because I've done a lot of writing the history of the General Assembly, that I'm most proud of is that in the 1990s and into 2000s, we had a practice for over 9 years in a row of having a major ecumenical leader, some leader of a Church of the Nazarene or the Nazarene Church or the somebody or other, come and sit on the platform through our whole General Assembly. And then at the end, stand up and be given the mic and say, you've got 20 minutes. What did you see going on here? How do you view what we're doing? And it was most interesting and also formed some real relationships. Well, fear, we have feared becoming just another denomination. By actively strategizing, organizing for Christian mission, I mean, isn't the likely result that soon we will be strangled by our own church machinery? We can't risk being just another denomination. So there you are, when you build any organization, whatever, are you trying to make us into a denomination? We are so afraid of that. We are afraid of finding new insights in the Bible that may put our movement pioneers in a bad light. Didn't this movement have most things right from its beginning? And I would say the answer is we had some fundamental things very right, but we also had some very odd biblical interpretations, and that was in a very different culture. And sometimes we do have to say some things that put some of our sacred pioneers in a bad light, and we really have a bad conscience about that. Affirming the great theological insights of church history. We're afraid of that. Isn't openly affirming any creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, anything from church history, isn't affirming anything like that an unacceptable block to fresh thinking, to getting in the road of the Holy Spirit? I might just say, parenthetically, I almost, Michael, had to change today, but I decided not to. Right now, the Committee on Credentials of the General Assembly that I've chaired since its beginning is meeting right now in my absence, and they are deciding on the possibility of a major theological essay being put in the credentials manual. They think that is so needed that we don't have a backbone, we don't have any common understanding of what we believe, and and by the way, now more than 50% of the people who are coming before our credentials committees around the country for ordination have little or no background in the Church of God at all, and they're not that interested either. They really want ordination, and they just want to get out there and be active in the church. And we are increasingly losing any understanding of who we are in our own leadership cadre. Well, that's being addressed today. By the way, as soon as we're done here, I'm going to make a couple of calls and see what happened, because I don't know. Let's see. We are very afraid of what we found out about church history, and that is that the book of Revelation had explained it all. And then C.E. Brown in the 1930s began publishing books saying, we weren't the last Reformation. We weren't even the first to think that we were the last. There's a whole string of these great renewal movements that go clear back into the 13th century with the Waldensians and others. Actually, we are part, and that caused me, one of my books that's been very popular among the Mennonites and Quakers and some other people is called Radical Christianity. In fact, we are a representative of the Anabaptist movement and the radical Reformation trend, which has many names across church history and is a very proud history. But we've suddenly realized we weren't the only and the last. We are one of many across the many centuries. That messes with our head, because that isn't what we thought about in the beginning. And we have to decide, is that bad news or is that refreshing good news? Because we really understand and whatever. Let's see. I would say that across in this volume of Forward Ever Forward, what I'm saying now is said 10 times over in here in many, many different kinds of ways with all sorts of illustrations. There are a whole series of issues that I try to explore that, particularly since the 1930s and right up to now, have been tension points where we have been living in this vacuum and we've struggled over these issues. Let's see, since I quoted E.A. Reardon, 1929, his son Robert, in 1980, that was our big centennial celebration year. Bob Reardon, the son, said this: with the collapse of last Reformationism, we seem lost on the scene, without distinctives, without identity, and without comrades in arms. We have built few friendly ties with other Christian groups and have trashed and alienated most of them. Now, that was our centennial in 1980. Well, we have struggled over relationships. We've struggled over reaching our hands. And we have struggled. I have 7 here. All I could do is maybe quickly name them. I can't really do anything much with these. The equality of Blacks and women in church life. Early in our history, we were a model, I think, of what the church ought to be in these regards. We threw the church wide open and said, we are free people. We are free of machinery and human discriminations. If the Spirit moves, we accept. If the Spirit calls a woman, God bless her. That's the Spirit's business. If the Spirit says that Black persons are totally equal in church life, who on earth are we to argue with the Spirit? Let's get rid of all these human breakdowns. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, why the Church of God movement has a larger percentage of African Americans in its constituency in North America than any other Protestant body that isn't totally Black. If it's a totally Black organization, but the Nazarenes, the Wesleyans, the Free Methodists, the Methodists, you go down and name them. If I go into a meeting somewhere, they're always saying, how did you get all those African Americans to come to you? We'd love to have those people. Where is the manual, the program that got them? I say, if you think you can do that with a manual, you've already failed. But we had this tendency to say, we are now free in Christ. We are free to follow the Spirit however the Spirit moves. That brought people like African Americans who wanted liberation and wanted liberated in the church to feel equal. Part of the problem with attention. We have had a lot of separation of black and white, even in this movement. We never wanted that. We never planned that. But we also succumbed to a lot of racism quietly in this country and wound up with some things we never would have planned and would never justify. We just sort of do it. Women, if you go back to the 1920s and 30s, half of the ministers in the Church of God, if you get them in a yearbook, were female. Well, now if you can get 6 or 7%, we're doing well. We now have Church of God congregations who refuse to entertain the idea of a woman for ministry. That is so contrary to our tradition and our basic insights. And yet here we are. We have succumbed to a culture around us in ways that are very in tension with who we are. We've gained educational respectability. We have 4 universities in North America now that are quality operations. Problem is, they have to follow standards of accrediting secular standards as well as church. And that's always a tension of church and school. Back to 1917, when the General Assembly worried, if we have a school, oh my, don't ever let anybody graduate with a degree, because they'll think they're smarter than somebody who's really given over to the Spirit. We've struggled over the whole organizational thing, of course. We've struggled over how to deal with the economics of the marketplace, because church extension, for instance, is one of the worst things that's happened in our history, when all of a sudden the economic investments that they had on behalf of church extension were being called into question. And all of a sudden we had an entire generation of lawyers making millions of dollars on church money, trying to prosecute. Some people would say persecute. By the way, I would say if there's any lesson to be learned, we have got to find out that in the church, we better take care of our own business. Because if we ever let our business get out into the public courts, it is nothing but straight downhill. I hope we can never do that again. We've had a lot of tension over war and peace issues because we had a lot of Mennonites early. Well, are we a peace movement? Yes. No. We are not a classic peace movement like the Mennonites or the Quakers. If you go into the 6 actions of the General Assembly on this matter over the generations, you'll find out that, number 1, we totally support anybody who wants to be a conscientious objector. We totally support anybody who thinks that conscientious objectors are cowards. We support both in our youth. Do we respect war as an option for solving problems? In the Second World War, the General Assembly said, yes, it's sad, but sometimes you need to do it. But you go back right after World War I, and there's an action of the General Assembly that says war is of the devil and must never be engaged in regardless, because nothing but evil comes out of it. Well, as you can see on the war and peace issues, we're just sort of all over the place, and we kind of come and go with the flow. Since I've been the editor of all of our ministerial credentials manuals since they started in the 1980s, I could talk a long time about that. In the 1940s, the General Assembly said for the first time, we have got to have a credentials manual. We have got to somehow regularize how we call and credential ministers. There have to be some kind of standards. Everybody's doing his own thing, and we can't stand that. Everybody agreed. And from the 1940s to the mid-1980s, We never got around to doing it. But we finally did in the 80s. And actually, only for the first time in 2017 did the General Assembly say, we not only have one, but everybody is expected to follow it. Now, up until 2017, it always said in the manual, we think this is wise. We think these are the ways to go. This is how it should be done. We hope that you'll adopt it as an assembly. And we'd also think if you don't want to do something in there, could you please just make clear, well, I'm not doing that, whatever. And we had a manual, but we were still all over the place. Actually, in the last 3 years, we have really begun to be together on this thing. It's an amazing thing, but the current manual has been adopted as an official guideline legally in every assembly in North America, save Western Canada right now, or New England, which is in complete chaos and doesn't know what's going on up there. We have 2 holdouts, but those are being worked on. The credentials manual is a whole world unto itself. One of the things that we have feared, and I'm looking at my watch, it's 3:51. One of the things that we fear is what we would call liberal leadership. People who actually want to try to lead in our movement are automatically suspect. My dear friend Arlo Newell, who is about as loved a pastor and leader and editor as this movement's ever had, said to me one day, Barry, I have lived in Anderson, Indiana now for 1 year and been editor at Warner Press. Before that, I was the most loved pastor in the movement. I now am getting the most nasty letters from pastors all over the country, and people would think that I am terrible. What changed in 1 year? He said, Barry, only one thing, my address, Anderson, Indiana. There is this tremendous, that's in our DNA. We are free people. In fact, I would say this, because we've had outsiders study us organizationally and have repeatedly said, here is the fundamental issue in the Church of God. You are committed deeply to 2 values. And and both of them are wonderful. The unfortunate thing is they're in conflict with each other. Value number 1, unity. We believe in a unified church. We believe that God should bring us together and we are all one. We also believe in liberty. We can be unified, but nobody in that unified body is going to tell me what to do, or my church, because we are free in our unity. Well, there you are. 2 very fine values. We are deeply committed to both, but it is just so often that we crunch into each other. May I say one thing, that we have a major issue today that we don't even know how to begin to deal with. And that is, number one, we don't want to be a colonial movement, going out and try to take over the churches of the world and make them do what we want. We set up colonies out there like the British did or whatever. We really don't want to do that. That's wrong, and we know that. We do know, however, that after, I believe 1983 was the first year, that the Church of God movement, its constituency, is larger outside North America than in. And every year since, that gap has grown until today. The Church of God movement is way bigger outside North America than inside. And yet, we're North Americans. We are the movement. It started here. We formed things. And surely, well, we know that's wrong. But here's the problem. With our anti-organizational DNA, for instance, we don't have any venue for interconnectedness and strategic planning worldwide in this movement. We just don't have anything. And so how do we proceed with a unified message to the whole Christian community when we have no apparatus to try to foster our own unity inside. That is a major issue. And we don't know what to do with it. And I would just say, we always used to say, well, what we did was have Tri-S from Anderson College, Anderson University. And what we do would be have a world convention someplace. And then we would get a lot of Americans who wanted to do an exotic vacation. And we'd charge them extra, and they would know that, so that we could pay for poor leaders from many countries to come, and we could get together. Well, we had 8 or 9 world conventions over the years that they were pretty good. They were very worthwhile, but that's how they were funded. When 9/11 came along, boom, no more than that. Can't do it anymore. And we've done nothing since 9/11. And I would say, I wish somebody in California, you're supposed to be innovative in all things out there. Somebody out there grab the bull by the horns. What are we doing right now? We're having a Zoom meeting. How much money did you spend to get me to California to talk to you?
A couple thousand.
All I had to do was put up with talking to Michael and whatever. We right now could easily put together a world council or something of the Church of God, not that's going to dominate and run everything, but that could be a body. Every church in Bangladesh or whatever could elect 2 or 3 members to participate in a world body that would help us to get to know each other and to strategize mission together and to work together on common problems. And we could do that on screen monthly and not spend a nickel. That was totally out of the question a decade ago. I mean, you can't do that. We could do it now. And I think we had better do it. We better do something, because, well, otherwise we still think we are the movement. We white guys here in North America on a Zoom, and we are hardly a minority of the movement anymore. We are the worldwide church as we had envisioned, but we're not doing much to actually activate that unity. By the way, Michael would know that I've tried to write a little booklet on the movement aimed at lay people, particularly new lay people in our Church of God congregations, to try to get them going. And now, as I said, right now, this meeting's going on about a statement. I would confess, I wrote this thing that's 9 pages long that they're considering, but we consulted with about 20 other people, and all of our teachers of Bible and theology in all of our universities all participated in looking it over. But the strong feeling of the Committee on Credentials, for instance, we have got to not write a creed. We couldn't tolerate that. We can't write a creed, but we do have a set of distinctive theological points of view that are very distinctive to us, a cluster of them. And we need to make sure that people who are coming into our movement as new leaders are aware of those and are affirmative of those. Else we are not going to have a movement that'll hold together hardly at all for very much longer. We are so diverse now that we've got to take some kind of initiative if we want to stay. And Michael, as he said, participated in Project Imagine recently, which was quite the aggressive attempt on the part of Church God Ministries to say, can we sit down together as a group of leaders and imagine what the future could be and should be, and imagine some way to make it happen? Well, I mean,
Dr. Callen, I know we're out of time. One of my questions would be, how do we come against these fears that you've talked about? And maybe you're mentioning that now, but.
Well, no, I haven't mentioned much about how we come against it. One of the things, of course, I've had a long career with Anderson University, such fear that education will undermine the church. I just, by the way, I've got it lying over there. I just finished writing the biography of John Pistol, the new university president Anderson. That book is a Christian witness that is amazing. And it happened in the Transportation Security Administration. It happened right up to the director's office where John was of the FBI in the United States, and on and on. We have got to see that we already have some people who dare to go out into the public spheres, into the ecumenical spheres, and carry their Christian witness and do it well, and do not become destroyed in the process. John's a marvelous example. It's just called John Pistol, and it's available now, hardback, softback, Kindle edition, and it's going to be available in audio edition this summer. Just go on Amazon or whatever. That'd be a great thing to look at. We have got to champion what we can. We're going to try out of Project Imagine. What came out of all that? A couple of little modest pilot projects we might try if we don't upset anybody. And one of them is on the West Coast, where the companies on the West Coast are trying to really figure out how they might coordinate among themselves for some real advantage to everyone. And I think that could be the success that comes out of Project Imagine over these few years. Well, if we do, we need to be smart enough to say, do you see what happened on the West Coast? Come on, why doesn't somebody else try that? It can work. We've had it to work. We have to hold up our success stories rather than just run around worrying about our failures here and there. Bad news travels so fast. Good news just never makes the front page. We've got to stop that. We have got to stop that. By the way, I am the editor of Aldersgate Press, which is the publishing outreach of the Wesleyan Holiness Connection. 14 holiness denominations today who are coming together again, like they did in the late 19th century, to try to say holiness is desperately needed to revive the churches today. And I and only one or two other people have been involved at all from the Church of God. That's wrong. They ask for us to be there. By the way, would you like to know what the website address is of the Wesleyan Holiness Connection? Holinessandunity.org. That is right at the heart of what we're all about. Well, I've been there, but where's everybody else? We've had a few marvelous people. James Earl Massey is one of our shining lights in that regard. Gilbert Stafford was a wonderful, not only Bible or a theology teacher, he was an ecumenist. He was a relator out there. In 1980, this was our centennial. John Smith, Church God historian, went. Now, don't spread the word on this. We'll try to keep it secret. He went as a formal observer to the National Council of Churches annual meeting in New York. They were in a huge ballroom. Roman Catholic priests, two patriarchs from the Eastern Orthodox Church, everybody was there. He said beforehand, we had this lovely booklet we put together in the School of Theology called We Believe. He said, would it be acceptable if I put a copy of that at every place, every table, in every place setting in this whole banquet hall, just because it's our centennial? And they said, well, sure, I guess you can do that. People were coming up to John from the Roman Church, from the Eastern Church, whatever, saying, who are you people? This is really interesting. Never heard of you. Why don't you come and talk to us about this kind of thing in our meetings? Nobody's ever said anything like this to us before. Well, because we're afraid of you. I don't know. Because you might hurt us. You might compromise us. I don't know. What do you say? And by the way, Michael, you shut me up when I need to. Two major thrusts of the Church of God movement both came to substantial fruition in the 20th century. And we had nothing to do with either one of them, and we bashed both of them the whole way. Number one was the ecumenical movement. When beginning in 1911, the world church decided we have got to find unity among ourselves if we're ever going to be effective missioners in the world. The ecumenical movement of the 20th century. And now, again, don't tell anybody out there I said this. The second one is the Pentecostal movement. We said from the beginning, the Spirit is everything. The Spirit gifts. The Spirit should be the head of the church. The Spirit is this, the Spirit is that. The 20th century Christian church said, you know what, folks, you're right. We have to be alive in the Spirit. We have to be gifted by the Spirit. Well, we didn't like that, some extremes here and there, so we just bashed it. But the Christian community has discovered us and our major themes and have taken them over to try to make sense out of them. And we have stayed in the backwater and said, we don't want anything to do with it. You're probably not going to do it right. And so we're not involved. We have got, brothers, we have got to stop that. We have got to stop that. And who we are and what we have stood for in the main floats today, is needed today, makes sense to other people today. If we just had the nerve to put it out there and live it as well as talk it, we could do a lot of things.
Yeah.
If we're not too afraid.
I agree.
Well, I've talked too much.
No, that's perfect.
You've been very patient, guys, very patient.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Callen. I appreciate you being here with us. Thanks so much for explaining many of these things and the situations that we find ourselves in. Just a simple, it's not simple in terms of easy, but it is simple in terms of at least some conclusions coming in my head as I hear you. I notice that we are not very good at repenting. And it sounds like that is one of the key things that happens. So if you don't repent, then you get backed up and built up. And there are just areas where we've made wrong decisions.
Frankness in this book. We got to do some repenting. We've got to face some things, and we can't move on if we don't deal with it. And I would say there's a young regional pastor in Central California who makes my little bit of face hair look sick because he's got the real stuff there. And I feel like I'm in the minor leagues. Am I talking about you, Michael?
I think you are, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I'm sorry we ran over a little bit time-wise.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for jumping on. Ron, did you have one question that you were asking? Let me see if I can send that over. You're on mute right now, so we can't hear you. See if you can unmute. There we go.
Well, I was unique in that I came to Warren Pacific as a non-Christian, as an athlete, even though I have a strong liberal church background, so I was acceptable, and I'd actually taught Sunday school to kids. But anyhow, I came to Warren, became a Christian, and so everything to me, the things you were sharing, it was all like, okay, my mom thought I was in a cult right away because she was of Lutheran background. So I read everything, Church of God, and I was really highly motivated. But what I found out is first, salvation is the centerpiece of any group, but I'm saved in Church of God, so I'm Church of God. So now I got to try and make my theology work. All the problems you addressed, I came up with. I'd go to a ministry meeting and say, hey, listen, these end time things are suspect. It's past 1980 now, and your 100 years of kind of so you have to have an addition or understanding, or you have to expand your approach to the idea of being, of how we viewed us being. And then I went to a Mennonite Brotherhood seminary, which was very helpful, because I thought, there's a lot of alignment here. This is not bad at all in the biblical seminary in Fresno. And that was helpful. But then the issue, but I remember in the Church of God, I went to visit people that were breaking off from the Church of God because they were getting too liberal. Yeah. And, and they said, the guy, I brought a young man, I was teaching ministry stuff, and he said, I said, well, this holiness thing. He said, well, I said, I'm in holiness mode. He said, and my little young friend was with me. He said, I haven't sinned for 9 years and 2 months. And my young friend went, because the group had brought into it in Sacramento area, a group had broken off because they took holiness to the next level. And we were outcast, Church of God Edison, because we were too liberal. And it was a very interesting time period where I'm analyzing all these things. But if you can find centrality on a few points, of course, salvation is a big one. And, receiving every blood washed when you become a member by believing is a good point sometimes the structure is a little weak in implementing. The theology you have to be careful with, because the holiness thing goes all over the place, from the Pentecostals, who I have no problems with, and then the hard line, which become legalist, and so big challenges are there, but could be adopted in many ways. But I'm hopeful, and I hear and I listen to what people are saying. And this I appreciate all your sharing.
Thank you, brother. Good.
Yes.
All right, friends. Well, have a great day. And thanks so much for joining the call and being on right now. Bless you guys. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
Be blessed.
Bye-bye.